On September 18th, a 10-year-old boy attending a Japanese school in Shenzhen, Guangdong, was severely injured on his way to school. A 44-year-old Chinese man, whom the family had never met before, attacked the boy in front of his mother. The child was rushed to a nearby hospital, but tragically passed at around 1:36 a.m. on the 19th due to the severity of his injuries. This incident shocked people around the world and deeply disturbed the Japanese community, becoming a major topic in Japan's news coverage on China. Back in June, a similar attack occurred. On June 24th, a Japanese mother and child living in Suzhou were waiting for a school bus when a Chinese man with a knife attacked them. He then tried to board the bus to continue his attack. A bus staff member named Hu Youping, a woman from Suzhou, bravely intervened to stop him, but was fatally injured in the process. These consecutive violent acts targeting Japanese children have not only shaken Japan, but also sparked outrage among many Chinese citizens. Some residents of Shenzhen visited the site of the attack to leave flowers, with notes reading, "I'm sorry, child," signed by Chinese people from Shenzhen. They also condemned the CCP's long-standing policies of spreading hatred and manipulating public opinion. However, is this simply a case of hatred towards Japan? Let's take a step back and observe how the situation unfolded. Following the tragedy, China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian made a cold remark, describing the killing of the Japanese boy as an isolated case. This response fueled public anger in Japan, where anti-Chinese sentiments surged. Social media posts calling for a severance of diplomatic ties and urging Japanese citizens to avoid traveling to China started trending. In response to the public outcry, several Japanese companies took action. Panasonic was the first to allow employees stationed in China, along with their families, to return to Japan temporarily. The company even offered to cover travel expenses for those who wished to leave. Other Japanese companies followed suit, also offering to pay for flights home for their employees. A lawyer who serves Japanese corporate clients in China said, "We are seeing an increase in Japanese companies asking for advice on how to withdraw from China or lay off staff." There have been ongoing rumors in recent years about Panasonic preparing to exit China. In April 2023, Panasonic's joint venture battery plant in Shenyang, which was one of its earliest ventures in China, announced it would cease production by May 31st and enter liquidation, ending all business activities there. This follows Panasonic's earlier decisions to close a dry cell battery factory in Shanghai in 2022 and withdraw from the Chinese photovoltaic panel and batteries market in 2021. The company's once proud core battery business has largely disappeared from the Chinese market. By the end of 2022, Panasonic had already decided to move the production lines for its A7 servo motors back to Japan. This line, serving the high-end robotics and semiconductor manufacturing industries, was one of the few remaining core hardware production lines Panasonic still operated in China. According to a report by Nikkei, on June 23, 2024, Japan's multinational electronics manufacturer, Panasonic Holdings, has decided to relocate the production lines for mid to high-end household conditioners that are sold in Japan from Guangzhou, China, back to Japan by 2024. As the first step in this move, Panasonic began shifting the manufacturing of high-end air conditioners and outdoor compressors from Guangzhou to Japan. Starting in the 2024 fiscal year, the company will continue relocating production of mid-range models back to Japan. However, just one day after this announcement, a terrible tragedy occurred. The day after Japanese media reported on Panasonic's decision to withdraw, a Japanese mother and her child were attacked in Suzhou, and a Chinese woman sacrificed her life trying to stop the assailant. Was this merely a coincidence? Let's look at how events unfolded. On September 20th, 3 days after the horrific attack on the Japanese boy in Shenzhen, the Chinese government suddenly lifted its ban on Japanese seafood. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated on September 20th that both China and Japan had reached a 4-point agreement regarding the discharge of treated water from the Fukushima nuclear plant, and China would gradually resume importing Japanese seafood. But this raises a question. According to the Chinese government's logic, does the agreement suddenly make Japanese seafood safe to eat, leading to the immediate lifting of the ban? What was the previous ban really about if not food safety for Chinese citizens? The reality is clear to many. The reason behind the lifting of the ban is that Japanese seafood was safe all along. If there were truly any safety issues with Japanese seafood, it would be the Japanese people who consume it daily who would be the ones protesting. The treated water from the Fukushima plant is released into the waters near Japan. If the Japanese aren't worried about it, why should anyone else be? As we continue to monitor the developments, following the murder of the Japanese boy in Shenzhen, many local residents visit the site of the tragedy. They bring flowers and express their outrage at the criminal while offering sincere apologies to the victims. In stark contrast to this public outpouring, the Chinese authorities initially responded with indifference. They not only deleted photos and videos of people leaving flowers on social media, but also repeatedly claimed that the incident was an isolated case. The police even released a statement saying that the suspect had a criminal history. On September 19th, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian stated,
"Based on what we know, this is an isolated case. Similar incidents can happen in any country."
Then, during the regular press conference on September 20th, a Bloomberg reporter asked,
"So far, China has not told the Japanese anything to do with the motives or the motivations of the person who committed this act. Can you tell us anything now about the motives of the murderer in this case, considering that he's now been in custody for more than 2 days? Thank you."
Chinese Foreign Minister Mao Ning responded, "I suggest you refer to the relevant Chinese authorities for more information." Following this, a reporter from NHK, Japan Broadcasting Corporation, asked, "What Japan wants to know most is whether the suspect specifically targeted Japanese people." Mao Ning responded, "As for the specific motive, it will need to be determined through a thorough investigation. At the moment, I don't have any information on this." The Bloomberg reporter asked,
I don't understand how you can say that this is an individual case when you don't then say you don't have any information about the motive. If you know what the motive is, then you can say it's an individual case. But how can you say you don't know the motive but then stand there and expect us to believe that your claim that this is an individual case? Can you explain how those two things can be true at the same time, please?
Chinese netizens have pointed out the difference between logic and sophistry, stating that in the face of logic, sophistry seems pale and disgraceful. Comments flooded in, such as, "The Bloomberg reporter's question was too logical and they couldn't handle it," and "It's very difficult to keep up a lie." Mr. Zhu, a finance industry professional from Shanghai, shared his views. "I don't believe the recent consecutive attacks on Japanese children are isolated incidents, as the CCP claims, or simply individual acts. It's also not just the result of years of anti-Japanese brainwashing by the CCP on Chinese citizens. I think this is part of the CCP's malicious organized crimes." Mr. Zhu explained further, "The CCP government has engaged in long-term anti-Japanese propaganda and policies to divert attention from internal conflicts, such as selling out the national army to the Japanese during the war, cooperating with the Japanese against the Chinese nationalists, and trying to distract the public from the power struggles at the top and ever-looming governance crises. Indeed, many people have been deceived by this propaganda." He continued, "For instance, during the anti-Japanese protests in 2012, several incidents of vandalism occurred in Shanghai, Guangdong, and Shenzhen, resulting in severe injuries to Chinese citizens who had been brainwashed by CCP propaganda." Mr. Zhu also said, "But the large-scale anti-Japanese protests we've seen in the past were all orchestrated by the CCP, with military police, national security, and plainclothes officers coordinating to ensure the events went smoothly." He added, "This time, however, the large-scale anti-Japanese protests have been replaced by individual acts of violence, as the CCP no longer dares to organize such mass protests. The individual anti-Japanese attacks are intended to retaliate against Panasonic's withdrawal from the Chinese market and to intimidate other Japanese businesses still operating in China. From the CCP's perspective, Panasonic, being one of Japan's leading companies, poses a demonstration effect, making the CCP fearful and resentful, so they will stop at nothing to suppress and retaliate." Let's briefly look back at the 2012 anti-Japanese protests, which were the largest of their kind in decades. According to a Hong Kong media report from September 19, 2012, anti-Japanese protests erupted in around 100 Chinese cities starting on September 17th, in response to Japan's decision to nationalize the Senkaku Islands, known in Chinese as the Diaoyu Islands. Incidents of vandalism occurred in cities like Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. Foreign media reported that the CCP played a double game in the situation, encouraging the protests on the one hand while publicly controlling the situation on the other. Hong Kong media reported that on the eve of September 18th, around 300,000 armed police officers were placed on high alert across China. Some netizens disclosed that from the afternoon to the evening of September 17th, a large number of military vehicles appeared in cities like Guangzhou, Shanghai, and Changsha, with self-propelled artillery even spotted in the streets of Shanghai. The Hong Kong radio website reported that riot police and armed officers were deployed in many cities. Sources indicate that 300,000 armed police were on standby nationwide. The Washington Post and other international media quoted experts, stating that recent signs suggested the CCP authorities had fueled the outbreak of some of these protests. At the same time, officials were careful to control the crowds, fearing that the public's discontent might turn against the CCP government. The Washington Post also reported that anger was growing in China over the territorial dispute with Japan. The CCP was playing a double game, quietly encouraging the recent anti-Japanese protests while publicly managing and controlling them. The Daily Telegraph reported that during the protests, netizens discovered that those vandalizing Japanese brand cars were actually police officers. The International Herald Tribune added, "Since public gatherings in China are tightly controlled by the authorities, the current protests appear to have been at least partially sanctioned by some government departments." The report mentioned that police limited the number of protesters outside the embassy, with some people waiting their turn for the protest while eating lunch by the roadside. The report also stated there is evidence that some government officials directly encouraged the protests. Chinese netizens discovered that one of the organizers of the protests was the director of the Xi'an Public Security Bureau, disguised in plain clothes. At the same time, some Chinese commented that Cultural Revolution-style violence had resurfaced in China, and it was clear to many that there was an invisible hand orchestrating the anti-Japanese demonstrations. They listed 5 unusual aspects of the protests to support their claim. 1. Protests broke out simultaneously in dozens of cities. 2. The number of protesters was small, yet they caused significant damage, with the majority being young and middle-aged men who immediately began vandalizing with a clear sense of purpose. 3. Riot police across different cities consistently failed to intervene. 4. Various media outlets and official blogs framed the violent acts of vandalism as excessive displays of patriotism. 5. Posts showing the vandals on Weibo were swiftly deleted. This raises the question, were these protests truly organized by the people, or were they orchestrated acts of violence? As the protests spread, slogans opposing the CCP began to appear in demonstrations across regions like Hunan and Guizhou. Protesters called for freedom, democracy, human rights, and constitutional governance, with some even carrying banners demanding the removal of internal traitors and officials with hidden foreign assets. One anti-CCP slogan stood out to netizens as the boldest of them all. "How should we reclaim the Diaoyu Islands? Why not send China's urban enforcement officers and corrupt officials to do it?" After the riots of 2012, did Japanese companies like Panasonic announce the withdrawal of their employees or businesses? No, they didn't. So why was Panasonic's reaction so swift this time? The truth is, Japanese business people understood the real purpose behind the 2012 protests. While the protests were outwardly in response to the Senkaku Islands dispute, they were, in fact, a distraction engineered by the CCP. Earlier in 2012, a high-ranking official sought political asylum in the U.S. consulate in Chengdu, exposing a scandal involving Bo Xilai's wife, Gu Kailai, which triggered a power struggle at the highest levels of the CCP. The large-scale anti-Japanese protests in September coincided with the secret trial of Wang Lijun and served to divert attention from this internal crisis. This time, the situation is different. Panasonic's leadership fully understands the gravity of the situation. On June 23rd, just one day after the company announced the relocation of its air conditioner production line, a Japanese mother and child were attacked in Suzhou. Although the mother and child survived, it was a Chinese woman who lost her life while protecting the Japanese children. It's important to note that it would be impossible to recruit an attacker, coordinate the ambush, and execute the crime within just one day. This indicates that the attack was premeditated and organized by the CCP. Given the widespread presence of Chinese commercial spies, it's highly likely that Panasonic's plans to exit China were leaked well in advance. The fact that the attack occurred so soon after Panasonic's announcement suggests the CCP had prior knowledge of the company's intentions and had already planned the attack as an act of revenge, counteraction, and warning. The September 18th attack on the Japanese boy, which ended in his death, shows that the CCP has escalated its actions, leaving no room for error. This also reveals that the earlier attack, intended as a warning in response to Panasonic's exit, had failed. Panasonic did not alter its plans to withdraw from China, but instead continued to carry out the withdrawal decisively and irreversibly. In response to these attacks, Panasonic quickly announced the evacuation of its employees. Meanwhile, the Japanese government and media confirmed that the assaults were retaliatory acts by the CCP, specifically targeting Japanese companies and citizens. So, why are Japanese corporations preparing to leave China? Analysts believe that Japanese businesses have reached a consensus. The CCP's economy is on the verge of collapse, and it can no longer guarantee the interests of Japanese enterprises operating in China. In reality, the CCP's treasury has long been emptied by its elite, with assets transferred abroad. For years, global financial institutions have propped up China's operations to protect their investments and technologies in the country, creating a false image of prosperity. However, since the outbreak of COVID-19 in 2029, the prolonged 3-year lockdowns have dealt a fatal blow to China's industrial chains, exposing the fragility and emptiness of its economy and treasury. Global business leaders are increasingly recognizing that the so-called prosperity of the Chinese economy is built on a fragile foundation, heavily reliant on the international supply chains. In reality, the Chinese economy is solely propped up by foreign investments. Its true economic base has been severely damaged, if not entirely wiped out. The recent surge in various societal crises within China reflects the deep-rooted economic collapse that the country is facing. Foreign investors are becoming more aware that the sooner they withdraw from China, the safer they'll be. To make matters worse, on September 21st, in a WeChat group for publishing and media professionals, Huang Ruyi, a deputy county head in Sichuan province, made shocking comments. Huang, a CCP loyalist born in the 1980s, said, "Killing a child, what's the big deal?" and "Our rule is to kill Japanese." His words perfectly encapsulate the essence of the CCP's extremist and cult-like nature. Against this backdrop, will the CCP's attempts to intimidate Japanese companies into staying succeed? The answer seems evident.